The signal was a ghost. It was a jagged green spike on a monitor that shouldn't have existed, flickering in the back of a nondescript van parked 3 blocks away. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick, recycled, smelling of stale coffee and the sharp metallic tang of overheated electronics. It was raining outside, a heavy, relentless Medellín drizzle that turned the gray streets into black mirrors. The men inside the van didn't speak. They didn't move. They barely breathed. They were listening to the static. 3 blocks away, inside a second-story bedroom of a brick row house that looked exactly like every other house in the neighborhood, a man sat on the edge of a bed. He was heavy. His breathing was labored, a wet, rattling sound in the quiet room. The curtains were drawn tight, sealing the space in a perpetual twilight. There was a plate of half-eaten food on the nightstand, attracting a single persistent fly. He watched the fly. He watched it land on the rim of the glass. He watched it rub its legs together. He held a telephone receiver to his ear. His knuckles were white. The plastic was slick with sweat. He knew the rules. He had written the rules. 2 minutes. Never stay on the line for more than 2 minutes. Move constantly. Never sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row. But the rules belonged to a different man. They belonged to a man who commanded armies, a man who had brought a nation to its knees. The man on the bed was not that person anymore. He was a father who missed his children. He was a husband who was watching his wife being tortured by the bureaucracy of the state from 300 miles away. He looked at his watch. The second hand swept past the 12, past the 3, past the 6. He should hang up. Every instinct in his body, sharpened by 15 years of war, was screaming at him to sever the connection, to pull the battery, to run. But he couldn't. The voice on the other end was the only thing anchoring him to reality. If he hung up, the silence would return. And the silence was worse than the bullets. The silence was where the monsters lived. He spent his days in a state of sensory deprivation. He couldn't go outside. He couldn't open a window. He couldn't trust the food that was brought to him. Every plate was a potential assassination attempt. Every glass of water was inspected. The paranoia was not a symptom of his situation. It was his only remaining bodyguard. He was surrounded by men, yet he was entirely alone. The inner circle, the lieutenants who had sworn blood oaths to him, were dead or in prison. The ones who remained were young, inexperienced, and terrified. He could smell the fear on them. He saw the way they looked at him, not with the reverence of the old days, but with the pity one has for a dying animal. They stayed because they were too afraid to leave, not because they believed he could win. He knew this. He saw it in the eyes when they handed him the radio. He heard it in the hesitation when he gave an order. The empire of silver or lead had crumbled into an empire of dust. And in that isolation, the mind begins to turn on him. He whispered into the receiver. He asked about the hotel. He asked about the journalists. He asked if they were eating. In the van down the street, the needle on the signal analyzer jumped again, higher this time. It stabilized. A technician adjusted a dial, his movements microscopic, surgical. He looked at the officer beside him. The officer was staring at a map of the Los Olivos neighborhood. He held a radio in his hand, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The silence in the van was so heavy, it felt like pressure building behind the ears. The technician nodded, just once. The officer pressed the button. "Target acquired," he whispered. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of a guillotine blade dropping. "He is stationary. We are closing the net." In the bedroom, the man on the bed froze. He stopped talking mid-sentence. He didn't hear the van, he didn't hear the radio, but he felt it. A shift in the air pressure, a vibration in the floorboards, the sudden terrifying realization that the world outside the curtains had changed.
He stood up. The floor creaked. He looked at the door. He wasn't looking at the wood. He was looking through it, waiting for the sound that would end his life. He took a breath, and for the first time in 44 years, he didn't know what to do next. If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who ruled through fear rather than noise, you're already in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. There is a version of this story that you have been told. It is the version with loud explosions, high-speed chases, and the glorification of a criminal mastermind who went out in a blaze of glory, fighting an army with a golden gun. That is the version sold to tourists. That is the version printed on T-shirts in the markets of Medellín. But that is not what happened. The truth is far quieter. The truth is that the most powerful man in the history of the underworld did not die because he was outgunned. He did not die because his enemies were smarter. He died because of a mistake so simple, so human, that it was almost embarrassing. He died because he forgot that the world had changed and he had stayed the same. What you are about to hear is the reconstruction of a collapse. Not the collapse of a cartel, but the collapse of a mind. We're going to strip away the myth and look at the man in those final 48 hours. We will look at the paranoia that ate him from the inside out. We will look at the betrayal that didn't come from a rival, but from the silence of his own friends. This story will permanently change how you understand power, loyalty, fear, and control. To understand the end, you must first understand the isolation. By late 1993, the man who had once offered to pay off his country's national debt was living in a state of squalor that would have broken a lesser man. He was not moving between palaces anymore. He was moving between safe houses that were little more than concrete boxes. The luxury was gone. The parties were gone. The zoo, the planes, the exotic animals, all of it was a memory. His world had shrunk to the size of a bedroom. Itself. He began to obsess over details that didn't matter. He would clean his glasses for 10 minutes at a time. He would rearrange the few books on the nightstand. He would stare at the wall, catatonic for hours, replaying the decisions that had led him here. The silence was the worst part. For a man who had lived his life surrounded by noise, music, engines, gunfire, laughter, the silence of the safe house was deafening. It allowed the ghosts to come in, the faces of the judges, the police officers, the rivals, the innocents. They filled the room when the lights went out. This was the state of the king on December 1st. He was turning 44 years old. A birthday is usually a celebration of life. For him, it was a marker of survival. There was a cake. There was a small celebration with the few bodyguards left, a grim affair with cheap wine and forced smiles. But his family wasn't there. His wife, his son, his daughter. They were trapped in a hotel room in Bogota, guarded by the government, bargaining for their lives. He wanted to be with them. The desire was a physical ache. It was this desire that made him careless. He began to use the radio phone more frequently. He knew the risks. He knew the search block, the elite police unit tasked with hunting him down, was scanning the frequencies 24 hours a day. He knew the Americans had brought in technology that could triangulate a signal within seconds. He knew all of this. But arrogance is a blinding light. He had evaded them for so long, he began to believe he was invisible. He began to believe that he was smarter than the machines. Or perhaps, deep down, he simply didn't care anymore.
Perhaps the fatigue of running was finally heavier than the fear of dying. What Pablo didn't know was that the game had shifted beneath his feet. The Americans weren't just listening anymore, they were mapping. A unit known as Spike had deployed sophisticated aerial surveillance and ground-based direction-finding teams. They had turned the city of Medellín into a grid. Every time Pablo pressed the transmit button, he wasn't just sending a voice, he was painting a target on his own back. On the morning of December 2nd, the city of Medellín woke up under a blanket of gray clouds. It was a Thursday. The streets were busy with the mundane rhythm of life. People were going to work, buying groceries, catching buses. They had no idea that in a quiet neighborhood called Los Olivos, the final act of a tragedy was beginning to play out. He woke up late. He ate a simple breakfast. He read the newspaper, scanning the headlines for his own name. It was there, as always, but the tone had changed. They weren't writing about him with fear anymore. They were writing about him as a problem to be solved, a pest to be exterminated. Around 1 p.m., he felt the urge again, the need to connect. He picked up the phone. At the headquarters of the search block, a technician sat in front of a glowing screen. He had been staring at the green lines for 8 hours. His eyes were burning. The coffee in his cup was cold. He was about to take a break when the line jumped.
A signal. It was faint, buried in the static of the city, but it was there. The pattern was unmistakable. It was the voice. The technician didn't shout. He didn't cheer. He simply pressed a button and spoke into his headset. He's on. 3 words, that was all it took to mobilize an army. Colonel Martinez, the man who had dedicated his life to this hunt, was standing over the map. He watched the triangulation vectors appear on the screen. 1 line from the north, 1 line from the west. They intersected over a cluster of houses in Los Olivos. "Hold him," Martinez whispered, as if the fugitive could hear him. "Keep him talking." Back in the room, the man on the bed was talking to his son. He was trying to explain why he couldn't surrender. He was trying to explain that the world wasn't fair, that the people hunting him were worse than he was. He was rambling. He was desperate. "Juan, be good to your mother." The call dragged on. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. This was the suicide note. He wasn't writing it on paper. He was speaking it into the airwaves. Every second he stayed on the line, the net tightened. Outside the house, the neighborhood remained oblivious. A delivery truck drove by. A dog barked. But slowly, subtly, the environment began to change. Unmarked vans drifted into position at the end of the block. Men in civilian clothes, heavily armed, moved through the alleyways. They moved with the precision of predators who finally have the scent. They didn't rush. Rushing causes mistakes. They moved methodically, clearing the perimeter, checking the angles. They needed to be sure. They couldn't afford a shootout that killed civilians. They couldn't afford for him to slip away through a tunnel or a hidden door. This was the moment everything began to crack. The signal was verified. The specific house was identified. The order was given. Inside the room, the man sensed something. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a sight. It was a feeling. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The air pressure seemed to drop. He stopped talking mid-sentence. "Wait, I'll call you back." He hung up. The silence rushed back in, but this time it was hostile. He stood up. He walked to the window. He peered through the slit in the curtains. Nothing. Just the street. Just the rain. But then he saw it. A slight movement in the reflection of a parked car. A shadow that moved where there should be no shadow. He backed away from the window. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Limon, his only bodyguard in the room. Limon was young, loyal to a fault, and completely out of his depth. "They're here," the man whispered. There was no panic, no screaming,
just a cold, hard acceptance. The game was over. The only thing left was to decide how it ended. He grabbed his pistol, a Sig Sauer. It felt heavy in his hand. He checked the magazine. Full. He didn't put on his shoes. He didn't have time. Downstairs, the front door exploded inward. The sound was thunderous, wood splintering, metal twisting. Then came the boots, heavy, fast, coordinated. "Police! Police! Search block!" The shouts echoed up the stairwell. He didn't wait. He moved toward the back window, the one that led to the roof. This was the escape route, the only way out. Limon went first. He scrambled out the window, onto the red clay tiles. He was fast, agile. He made it to the edge of the roof, looking for a way down to the street behind. But the street behind was not empty. A volley of gunfire erupted from the alleyway. It was a wall of lead. Limon jerked, his body dancing the macabre jig of death, and then he fell. He hit the pavement with a wet thud. The man in the bedroom heard the shots. He knew what they meant, but he climbed out anyway. He stepped onto the tiles. The rain made them slick. He was barefoot. The rough clay scraped his skin. He felt the cool air on his face. He looked to the left. Soldiers. He looked to the right. Police. He looked down. The house was surrounded. Every angle was covered. Every rifle was pointed up. He was on a stage, elevated above the world he had tried to conquer. He raised his gun. He fired blindly, wildly, not aiming at anyone in particular. It was a gesture of defiance, not a tactical move. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was telling them he was still there. The return fire was instantaneous. It came not from one gun. It came from everywhere. The air around him snapped and hissed. Bullets chipped the tiles, sending shards of red clay flying like shrapnel. He ran. He tried to run across the peak of the roof. He was heavy, clumsy. He stumbled. A bullet hit him in the leg. He grunted, but kept moving. Another hit his shoulder, spinning him around. The pain was distant, dull. The adrenaline was masking the trauma. He reached the edge of the roof. He could see the ground below. He could see the grass of the backyard. It looked peaceful. Then the final shot came. It wasn't a spray of machine gun fire. It was a single, precise crack. The bullet entered behind his right ear. It was the kind of shot that turns the lights out before the body even hits the floor. There was no pain, no realization, just an abrupt, absolute end to the consciousness that had terrorized a nation. He collapsed. He fell forward, his face hitting the wet tiles. The gun slipped from his hand and slid down the roof, coming to a rest in the gutter.
For nobody moved. The police below kept their weapons trained on the slump of heavy fabric on the roof. They waited for him to get up. They waited for the trick. They waited for the bomb. But the body didn't move. The rain kept falling, washing the blood down the slope of the roof, staining the white walls of the house below. Slowly, cautiously, the officers approached. They climbed the stairs. They climbed out the window. They stood over him. One of them reached down and grabbed the thick black beard. He pulled the head up. The eyes were open, staring at nothing. The mouth was slightly agape. "Viva Colombia," the officer whispered. Then the chaos broke. The shout went out over the radio. "Verified! Verified! He is dead!" The news rippled outward like a shockwave. It went from the roof to the van, from the van to the headquarters, from the headquarters to the president, from the president to the world. But on that roof, the scene was grotesque. The men who had hunted him, the men who had lost friends and family to his bombs, gathered around the corpse. They didn't pray. They didn't show respect. They smiled. They grabbed his arms. They posed. They took a camera and snapped a photo.
It is the image that history remembers. The bloated, bloody body of the drug lord, with a group of smiling policemen standing over him like big game hunters with a trophy lion. It was a moment of barbaric victory. It showed that in the war against a monster, the hunters had lost a piece of their own humanity. In the hours that followed, the legend began to mutate. The people of Medellín, the poor who he had built houses for, wept in the streets. They didn't see a terrorist, they saw a savior who had been martyred by the rich. The politicians celebrated, claiming that the era of narco-terrorism was over. The rival cartels toasted with champagne, knowing that the market was finally theirs to divide. But the truth was more complicated. The death of Pablo Escobar didn't end the drug trade. It didn't stop the violence. In fact, cocaine production increased in the years after his death. The monopoly was gone, replaced by a fragmented, competitive, and efficient network of smaller cartels. He was the dam that held back the flood, and when he broke, the waters drowned the country. His death revealed the ultimate paradox of power. He had more money than he could count, but he couldn't buy a loaf of bread. He had thousands of soldiers, but he died with only one by his side. He controlled the government, but he couldn't control his own fate.
As the sun set on December 2nd, the body was brought down from the roof. It was loaded into a van. There was no gold coffin, no state funeral, just a body bag and a trip to the morgue. The king of cocaine was just meat. The autopsy report was clinical. It listed the entry wounds. It listed the contents of his stomach. It reduced the myth to biology. But it couldn't capture the weight of the moment. It couldn't explain how a man from a peasant village had risen to challenge the world, and how the world had crushed him. There is a theory, whispered by some, that the final shot, the one behind the ear, was not fired by the police. They say the angle was wrong. They say the stippling on the skin suggested a gun held at close range. They suggest that in those final seconds, realizing he was trapped, Pablo Escobar did the one thing he had always promised he would do. Better a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the United States. Did he pull the trigger himself? Did he choose his own exit? Or was it the bullet of a sniper? The truth is, it doesn't matter. Whether it was suicide or execution, the result was the same. The man was gone. The idea remained. We look back at this story not to admire the violence, but to understand the fragility of control. We build our castles, we hoard our wealth, we draw our lines in the sand, but in the end, we are all just waiting on a rooftop in the rain, listening to the static, waiting for the door to break. Power is a borrowed thing. It is never owned, and the interest rate is always higher than you can afford. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.